I've basically put together my idea of migratory connectivity and the general conservation implications. There are some terms and conditions to say first. Whenever you generalize in biology, you're setting yourself up as a hostage to fortune. But if you wish to move conservation forward, particularly if you want to apply and have effect on multiple species, sometimes you have to make generalizations. So those of you that are very precise determinist scientists, I apologize to you now, and as I've apologized in the past. There are obviously, the devil is in the details, and here we are trying to generalize. But anyway, terms and conditions over, let's go for it. So migratory connectivity, straightforward concept. It's the idea of linking up where animals, migrant animals, breed to the other places that they go to when they're not breeding. Now, here's an example of connectivity the proper way round, which is looking at the connectivity of wintering whitethroats in central Nigeria and going off to their breeding grounds in Europe. And you can see from this small point at Ablori, Jos, Nigeria, that these few whitethroats have been tagged. They migrate north to Europe during the summer, and they spread out over a very large area of Europe. It's a small sample size. So we can connect whitethroats in the center of Nigeria with whitethroats from Eastern Europe all the way across to Russia. But how do we sort of measure this in a way that we can compare it across species and draw generalizations for conservation? Because if you looked at that whitethroat graph, you think, great, we need to conserve a large part of Eastern Europe to look after the whitethroats that are wintering in Nigeria. Now, if you look at the literature, you see that connectivities often very imprecisely measured. Here's an example. Here's a diagram. The one on the left says strong connectivity. The one on the right says weak or diffuse connectivity. And basically, it's very hard to spot the difference about what's going on there. To me, that just looks like quite, these birds are going everywhere. But these terms are absolutely prevalent in the literature. Say, my species has very strong connectivity, but actually, what does that mean? Now, it shouldn't be this way, because for some data we've got, because of bird tracking, it's very, very precise and very, very good. Now, this isn't an African Europe example, but it's a really good one. In the US, they're obviously ahead. Well, this is probably the only area in which they are ahead in terms of human development at the moment is migratory tracking, but that's another story. Wood thrushes, lots and lots of different populations tagged, and you can see they're going off into Central America. And then you can look at this in terms of probability. So you can say this proportion of the population ends up here, and the degree of overlap, and so on. So you can be fairly definite about what connectivity is. You're not talking about weak or strong, you're actually talking about percentage. And so kind of like the holy grail that we're after is some really easy measurement that we can get for birds to describe their connectivity so that we can then use that measure as a tool for conservation. Because clearly, if a bird goes to a very fixed place to spend its non-breeding time, has high connectivity, then you can focus on conserving that one place. But if they spread out all over the place, then your conservation solutions are going to have to be very different, and certainly not just dealing with protected areas. Anyway, I'm cutting to the chase a bit. So here's another measure that's used. It's called the Mantle correlation coefficient. And effectively, that's just looking at the correlation between the spatial arrangement of points, say, in the Northern Hemisphere with those points down in Africa. And if things cross over, you're going to have a low Mantle score. But if the birds stay very fixed in their spatial arrangement in both North and South components, then you have a high Mantle. And again, this is kind of held up as meaning something, but actually it's got one or two problems. So the old wind chat there's thinking high or low connectivity, same or different. What do we do? Well, I shall tell you what I think we should do. Now, this is based on a large analysis of as many tracks of land birds that I could possibly find that my census date was up to July 2019. So 101 land bird species, a lot of tracks. And I probably should have just stopped here because plotting the tracks, you end up with an absolutely lovely work of art. But sadly, I went on and analysed it, so I shall bore you with the results of that. So here's our first problem when you start looking at lots and lots of tracks. The first thing is that range, how much they spread out, the degree of connectivity depends on sample size. So look at on the left, you've got purple martins in the US, and they're spreading out all over the place, but there are loads and loads of birds being tracked. Compare it to red-eyed vireo, you might think, oh, that doesn't spread out very much compared to purple martin, but actually it spreads out to exactly the same degree as purple martin if you restricted your sample size to the same number for purple martin. Another problem, connectivity also depends on the spatial pattern of sampling. So if I was to say, is there any connectivity between populations in the Americas and in the Palearctic for barn swallows, you find no overlap. They don't winter in the same way. So you would say there was very, very high connectivity in that population. Now, looking at that, you're thinking ridiculous, because clearly they're very greatly spatially separated. But of course, this happens very much on a within populations as well. So somebody might sample swallows in, say, Estonia, Latvia, and somebody might sample them in Spain and talk about how there's very high connectivity between their populations. But that's not really surprising because they are very physically separated in the same way that you wouldn't really compare Europe and North America. So you need to think about sample size, you need to think about the spatial overlap. And if you look at overlap, how much populations overlap on the non-breeding ground, you find that overlap is a consequence of the spatial separation, i.e. you sample breeding sites a long way apart, they're not likely to overlap on their breeding ground. That's obvious. And there's the relationship. And as you sample more, so you end up with a larger degree of overlap. Now, both of these, if I present them like this, they're really obvious. Yet the literature is absolutely riddled through with people making comparisons without taking into account these two things. Now, the mantle test that's held out, because it comes from population genetics, people imagine it's somehow very clever, but actually it's just as flawed in terms of sampling bias as any measure. And you have to apply it properly. So mantle correlation coefficients, anything that's high up above 0.5 or heading to 0.6, you might say that there's some structure between the two populations. There's high connectivity. But when you plot it in terms of the mean distance between populations sampled, think back to the barn swallows being sampled in America or Europe, then you find that mantle's very sensitive to this just as well. And so we've got examples of where, for example, people have measured mantle correlation coefficient between willow warblers that are breeding up nearly in the US, in Siberia, with Europe, and saying there's very high connectivity. Well, of course there's high connectivity because they're massively spatially separated, practically on different continents. If you sampled in between, you'd find a massive degree of overlap. What we really so mantle correlation coefficient is very sensitive to the distance between the populations that you sample them. And almost never are any mantle correlation coefficients presented in controlling for this particular bias. It is quite resilient to sample size, though, which is good. So what the use of this is if you control for the distance between your breeding population sampled and then look at the residual distance. So here we've got ortolan bunting, and you can see its mantle correlation coefficient is much, much higher than predicted if it was just because of the distribution of populations. And then you can find high connectivity. So you have to control the spatial distribution of populations. So, but what I want to present to you is just a really simple, objective way that we can compare populations or species. So let's talk about migratory spread. So this is just if you start at a breeding point location, say in Europe, how far apart do all the individual birds that you track from that population end up on the non-breeding ground? So if you look at some high connectivity examples in the Americas, like North American wood warblers, and in the Africa Palearctic system, ortolans that I've already mentioned, or Eleanor's falcons, you can see that these species don't spread out much. You can see they're almost flying on parallel lines from where they breed to where they winter, where they spend the non-breeding time. Compare this to, say, barn swallow. You can see that barn swallows start at a point and then they spread out massively. So you end up with a huge amount of overlap. And when you look at whether migratory spread is a consequence of distance between breeding populations, conceptually it can't be actually, but I plotted the graph. There's no relationship. But also beautifully, it's not a consequence of sample size. True, you need maybe 3 or 4 to get a reasonable average. But actually, if you've just tracked 2 birds from the same place and you measure how far apart they end up, you end up with a reasonable idea of its migratory connectivity. So it's not really complicated at all. You just need your points on a map, just work out the average distance between all those points, and you've got an unbiased measure of connectivity. And if you look at how average migratory spread, mean distance between individuals on the non-breeding ground, how that relates to overall range, there's a very, very tight correlation. Population spread is about 2.4 mean individual distance between locations. So just track a few birds, measure their spread, and you've got an idea of the overall population spread. And you can see that these kind of relationships in ecology from real data sets, having this degree of variance explained is very, very unusual. So mean distance between wintering locations seems to be the most useful, best measure of connectivity. It's certainly the easiest one that I've ever had to explain to anybody. It's independent of sample size and sampling location. It's quite simple and objective. And any tracking study can produce this data, even with a couple of individuals. So, what's there not to like? But the most important reason to consider migratory spread as a measure of connectivity is because it allows you to test evolutionary hypotheses. It's, if you like, an inherent component of the behavior of the species that you're looking at, how it disperses, rather than things like mantle or overlap or maps, which are just descriptions. You're just showing a snapshot of where they are. Whereas what we're measuring with migratory spread is something which is susceptible to evolution, adaptation, something that will respond to things like climate change, and therefore the kind of thing that we really want to get involved with if we're interested in conservation. So kind of questions you can ask when you're looking at a measure like migratory spread for connectivity is you can ask how much of the variation in connectivity is simply geography, for example. You can start comparing like for like across species and ask general biological questions. So if you look at the availability of land for where most of the migrants in North America spend their non-breeding time, Central America, the top of North America, that might seem, if you had to walk across that's a big lot of land. But if you drop that in Africa, it's nothing, absolutely nothing. So migrants in the US are really constrained about how much migratory spread they can have compared to, say, African birds. African birds can really go for it. And when you do an analysis to see to what extent the availability of land predicts the migratory spread, you find that geography accounts for 38% of the variation, whereas species identity, and we're talking species as varies as swifts to nightingales to cuckoos to bee eaters, is only 25%. So I summarize this diagram by basically saying that my grandmother was right. I asked my granny, okay, tell me about migrant birds. She says, well, they fly south for the winter. That's more or less what they do. And they end up pretty much in the land that's available to the south. God bless my granny. So what we can do is control for things like geography, and we can control for the sampling bias statistically, and ask the question, when we, adjust for the fact that a bird species in America and has got limited land and is flying a shorter distance and there's a small sample size, whatever, what kind of spread do we have like for like? So here's a whole range of different species that we've got. On the right-hand side is the real data. So this is subject to all the biases I've been talking about. And then on the left, we have them statistically adjusted. And then if we rearrange this data, so this is rearrange the standardized maximum spread of wintering locations. So we standardize migration distance and their starting location. You find that suddenly there's not such a huge amount of variation. You've got some species like the Ortolan bunting that don't spread out much. You've got some that spectacularly spread out like ospreys. But by and large, 90% of species are spreading out quite a lot, but within the same degree, kind of like similar amounts. So from this, we draw the conclusion that low connectivity, large migratory spread is actually the norm. So you've got a range of species here that I've looked at in this analysis. You can see a whole range, 2 continents, flyways, birds of prey, swifts, catbirds, swallows, and so on. But by and large, on average, they're all doing similar things. There are exceptions, of course. There are these low ones, there are these high ones, but on average, most species are just spreading out quite a lot. So why? Why are they doing this? So the answer to this, and this is very key to conservation and how we apply our conservation effort, is climate change. Now, one thing that characterizes Africa is its absolutely fantastically variable climate. You talk about climate change in Europe, but often the scope of temperature change and change in rainfall that we might be predicting in Europe over the next 40, 50, 60 years, that variation occurs within areas of Africa over the course of a few years. I mean, it's true the overall trend may be going up in Africa in terms of temperature as it is in Europe, but we're talking about variation. Now, I first came across this paper 2005, the one that's predicting Armageddon in the Sahel, and I read this paper. I was very, very depressed because, yeah, why wouldn't you be? Because it's bad for migrant birds, it's bad for people. Brilliant model, fits the past data very well, so we have confidence that it predicts in the future. Luckily, next year I came across this paper, which predicts exactly the opposite. It's a brilliant paper. It's really good at predicting, published in a very high-profile journal. And great, puts a smile on my face because actually things are going to get better in the Sahel. It's going to rain. And then I came across this paper, which averages out all of those fantastically brilliant papers making predictions. And guess what? It finds that there's absolutely no agreement on whether the Sahel will be drier or wetter in the future. So this is my point. If we have no idea at all about how climate is going to change over the next few decades in the Sahel, then there's absolutely no way that any of our migrant birds have any idea of what's going to happen. And furthermore, if you look at our historical data of things like rainfall in Africa, you can see it's incredibly variable. And this is what migrants have to live with all the time. So this is 1950 to 1959. And where you see the black circles, it's raining. Where you see the white circles, it's not. 1960. See the change in a decade. So, it's almost unbelievable, the change in variation in that. So these are droughts, rainy rainy periods changing over a decade. 1970 to 1979. Look at that. This is what makes Africa so fantastic, kind of its blessing and also its curse, this huge variation that you have in climate. We live with it as human beings, but the migrant birds, this is what they're living with. And remember, this is a decadal change, not 100 years, not 1,000 years, but every 10 years. So why should you spread out as a migrant bird? It's because you don't know what the climate's going to be like. You should bet hedge. You send your juveniles off out of your nest and you don't put all your eggs in one basket. If the tortured analogy, extended analogy, if some birds go left and some birds go right, then at least one of them's going to find a suitable area. So imagine you've got shifting conditions and you've got this scattergun approach to dispersal for your brood, then at least some of your offspring will find suitable climate areas within Africa when they get there. And that might shift around Africa, but you're basically hedging your bets. So migration, as we know, it's an adaptation to climate change. Clearly, the migrants are tracking favorable conditions rather than putting up with the crap that we have to endure in a northern winter. But this low connectivity is a sort of default state for climate change. And there's been climate change within Africa and indeed Europe, the whole evolutionary history of migrants. You could argue that migrants evolved to track and deal with climate change, or to deal with climate change by tracking it. So this scattergun approach is brilliant for climate change, for unpredictability. But pre-adaptation to climate change has conservation implications. You'd think, brilliant, we've got climate change, big problem in the world, the migrants are all prepared for it. But then we find they're declining. They're all declining. This is a very classic analysis from Fiona Sanderson, 2006, which pointed out it doesn't matter how you slice it up, migrant bird populations in Europe are declining compared to resident populations, pointing the smoking gun very much at what's happening in Africa, what's happening on migration. So they're good at climate change, so why are they declining? The problem is that bet hedging is a very poor adaptation to habitat loss. So same diagram, again, the scattergun approach, and some of the offspring are landing in suitable area W2 and the X's aren't. So that's good. But what happens if you have habitat loss, a decreasing area of habitat? See what's happening? A smaller proportion of your offspring are hitting the target area now. So it would be so much better if the migrants could target the areas of existing habitat, but because they're pre-adapted to climate change, and don't forget the shift in climate is still going on in the background, then that's the wrong strategy. So selection might point them to specific areas of retained habitat, but the climate change is spreading out. There's much more advantage to spreading out. So to use another tortured analogy, they're between a rock and a hard place. So with climate change, high migratory spread is good and low migratory spread is bad. So you hedge your bets so that some of your offspring go to a suitable area. With habitat loss, it's the reverse. High migratory spread is bad and low migratory spread is good. It's best to be targeted to the remaining areas. And if you look at populations of migrants, this is looking at neotropic and Afro-Palearctic systems differently. You predict a positive correlation with population trend with low connectivity if climate change is dominating. But you predict the reverse if habitat change is dominating. This, one of the strategies is good for climate change, one of the strategies is bad for climate change, and vice versa. And really interestingly, you find the signal is different. So the neotropics are responding, if you like, populations that are better adapted to climate change, i.e. that spread out more, are doing better in the neotropics, which suggests that climate change is the big thing in the neotropics. Whereas you have the reverse in the Afro-Palearctic system, that actually spreading out is a bad thing, which implies that actually habitat change is what's dominating in the Afro-Palearctic. And without going into massive details about paleobiology and whatever, there is much more long-term climatic variation in the African European system than there is in the Nearctic system. So if you like, the migrants in the Nearctic have woken up and think, oh no, it's climate change. Afro-Palearctic birds, they're good with climate change, no problem. It's just we've got massively higher amounts of population growth and habitat change within Africa at the moment. Not so in the neotropics, hence the difference. And human population change in this dynamic is really, really crucial. It's quite hard to get a signal because there is not much connectivity. But if you try and relate whether or not populations of species are declining in terms of the human population change in the areas that they're spending the non-breeding season in Africa or the neotropics, you can find a signal. You can find that the rate of change of bird population change is proportional to human population change. So where you have increasing human populations, you have decreasing migrant populations. So where you have increasing human populations, you have greater habitat change, and so that this is fitting in to what we might expect. But no, a very small amount of variation is accounted for it. That's partly methodological because, as I say, you've got low connectivity. But I think that's quite interesting. There's another detail in this graph, but I won't go into it, so I don't go on too long. So overall, because of this low connectivity, any part of Africa which gets changed and becomes less suitable for migrants will affect pretty much any population in Europe that you sample, because there will always be some birds from your population in any part of Africa. So this is why we see kind of like overall average declines in migrant species, whether they're swifts, whether they're house martins, whether they're cuckoos. And so, of course, there's a lot going on in Europe, all sorts of stuff with that. But all of the migrant populations are being, if you like, taken down by habitat change in Africa. And then you come to a really profound conclusion. And if we were studying birds from an African point of view rather than a European point of view, this would actually would have been obvious a long time ago, that there's a lot of worry in Europe about declining migrant birds. Oh, our migrants are declining, our residents aren't. And that's pretty much because our residents have already declined. We've already done them. And it's now the migrants' turn. The migrants were much more resilient to it, but because the habitat change over their whole annual cycle now has caught up with them, their populations are declining. Now, migrant birds are pretty much the only populations of African birds that we monitor, that we really monitor properly, that we count systematically, because the counting goes all on in Europe, where there's lots of people, lots of time, and lots of citizen science, and you know the whole story. If we were counting the hornbills, if we were counting the tinkerbirds, if we were counting all of the African species rather than just the ones that go to Europe, we would be finding the same kind of declines. So on to the conservation, general conservation implications of this. How do you bring this all together? Well, this is the serial residency hypothesis. This is essentially where you have low connectivity, things spread out, they bet hedge, but once they get to a fixed place for their non-breeding season, they return to that place. And through the lifetime of a bird, which might be 3 or 4 years if you're a small land bird, if you're lucky, that's fine. Climate change is not going to kick in. And then you can reset each time you have a new a new brood. So essentially what we're talking about is survivable routes are repeated. So this means that there's a lot of inherent annual flexibility in change in migration routes. So we look at migration routes, we take snapshots of it, we might measure it with radar or whatever, or ringing records and things, and you imagine that's how it is. But that's just how it is at the moment. Wait 10 years, it'll look different. Wait 20 years, it'll look different, or perhaps it'll have shifted back to how it was 10 years before. But this means that we kind of need a slightly longer perspective before we can actually sort of take a deep sigh and think, okay, climate change and migrants we don't need to worry about as much. It's not the priority. But habitat change certainly is. So in terms of conservation, think about migrants along a continuum of a scale of connectivity, where you have small scale, high connectivity versus large scale, wide migratory spread, low connectivity. So you've got an aquatic warbler, which is our classic, very, very high connectivity, only 2-3 non-breeding sites in West Africa, quite a small breeding population in Europe. Very, very deterministic migration. Compare that with a windchat, which just basically goes for it, just spreads out as far as it can go. It's very super generalist, can occur in all kinds of habitats. So what are the conservation consequences along this continuum? And bear in mind that most migrants are like windchats. Few migrants are like aquatic warblers. Why are there few migrants like aquatic warbler? Because of flipping climate change. It's a very, very dodgy strategy. The aquatic warbler, it's no surprise, it's one of the most seriously endangered species in Europe. It's because it is going on a very, very thin tightrope. So in terms of conservation, think of the continuum from aquatic warbler to windchat, left to right on this slide, deterministic to stochastic. You've got land sparing solutions versus land sharing. So this is protected areas, work brilliantly for the aquatic warbler. They're only going to 2 or 3 places, make sure they're protected. Windchat, well, yeah, protect 2 or 3 areas, you'll protect some windchats, but most of the windchats are in the environment and further out, spread out. They're not in reserves. So you need to have conservation policies which are about de-intensifying or not being as intensive in the landscape as possible when converting to agriculture, retained landscape features. And so then to put that in terms of policy, that's about reserved areas versus sustainable development. Reserved areas, protected areas, you don't have to involve people. You should involve people, of course, but you don't have to. Sustainable development involves everybody. It involves education, it involves rights, it involves justice. It involves thinking through so many things. And then, yeah, you end up with migrants as well. But if you're focused in on migrant birds, then you don't leap immediately to sustainable development. Climate change is a priority for deterministic species. Yep, they're going to be very susceptible to shifts in habitat due to climate change, whereas those species which have high migratory spread, nah, it's not a priority. Relax. Back to policy. Governance versus education, protected areas, stopping hunting on particular bits of the flyway. That's all about governance. That's all about laws. Whereas migrants that spread out through the landscape, that live in the environment with us, that's all about education. We're back to sustainable development again. It's about solutions that involve talking to people, educating people, making them aware of what they share the world with. Local bottlenecks versus flyway agreements. Again, down the flyway for something like aquatic warbler, you can focus on a few key countries. If turtle dove's being shot in Spain or France, you can focus on those bottlenecks. But something like a windchat, you need flyway agreements. You need to talk to everybody, and everybody has to come to the party with a smile on their face if you're going to do something. So we're back to sustainable development. And what I've stuck down at the bottom applies, in terms of a scientific process, it's what I wrote it, but it also applies in terms of getting policy implemented, getting actions done. For high connectivity species, it's easy to fund. It's easy to make a case. Yes, protect this reserve. Fantastic. I feel so proud I saved a species. That's easy to do. Well, it's hard to do, but it's easier to do than the alternative, which is to actually change the whole way we do business as human beings, because that's actually the route to conserving migrants. So that's why migratory connectivity is important, because fundamentally it shows us that we cannot just protect areas. We need to protect specific areas. We need to think about the whole landscape all the way from South Africa all the way up to the tip of Norway in a very cohesive way. These birds tell us, it's in the word, it's connectivity. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. And thank you to lots of people that have talked to me and inspired me and measured things in conjunction with me.
Maintenant, je vais passer en français. Je vois que Will m'a souhaité bonne chance. Il a parlé de beaucoup de choses dans sa présentation très scientifique, mais je pense que j'irai beaucoup plus au niveau de l'impact pour la conservation. Donc, Will Cresswell nous vient de l'Université Saint Andrews en Écosse et il nous a fait une petite présentation intitulée Un guide rapide sur la connectivité migratoire ainsi que son implication pour la conservation. Donc, en général, il a demandé qu'il s'excuse parce qu'il a vraiment fait un condensé sur quelques espèces et donc il faut généraliser ça pour la conservation parce que c'est ce qu'on fait généralement pour pouvoir prendre des décisions. Donc, en général, il a parlé d'un concept de connectivité migratoire en montrant les liens qu'il y a entre les zones de reproduction des espèces migrateurs et les zones de non-reproduction entre l'Eurasie et l'Afrique. Donc, il a fait une petite introduction, bien sûr, sur la migration et un peu montrer comment des espèces migratrices qui viennent dans les zones de non-reproduction peuvent, en fonction de la distance de migration, changer leur mode de migration. Donc, il a montré un peu qu'on a deux problèmes auxquels on fait face par rapport à la migration. Le premier problème, c'est la connectivité des sites qui impacte la migration des espèces. Et le second aussi, c'est la taille des espèces qui font la migration. Donc, il a montré un peu qu'on a le changement climatique qui peut impacter comment ces espèces migrent et comment elles élargissent leur migration ou pas. Et aussi montrer comment le changement des habitats impacte aussi ces migrations. Donc, il a dit un peu au niveau des changements climatiques que si on n'a pas d'idée sur l'évolution du climat, par exemple dans le Sahel, où la variabilité climatique est énorme, alors on ne pourrait pas vraiment prédire comment les espèces là vont migrer et les espèces non plus ne pourront pas savoir comment migrer et aussi perdre peut-être en niveau de population. Donc ça conduit à un déclin. Donc ce que les espèces migratrices font parfois, c'est que si elles doivent faire une longue migration, elles utilisent généralement des voies étroites. Donc, il faut vraiment une connectivité plus élevée vraiment sur ces sites de migration. Alors que si elles veulent faire, par exemple, une migration courte, elles s'éparpillent un peu pour pouvoir faire ces migrations. Et donc, c'est une stratégie de survie aussi pour ces espèces, pour ne pas mettre, comme il a dit, tous les œufs dans un seul panier. Donc, augmenter les chances de survie pour l'espèce en permettant à l'espèce de pouvoir migrer dans ces zones de non-reproduction. Et donc, on est allé un peu au niveau de l'implication pour la conservation, où il a montré un peu qu'on s'est beaucoup concentré sur les espèces migratrices qui viennent de l'Europe, alors que il y a beaucoup de problèmes au niveau des espèces migratrices non reproductrices qui sont aussi en Afrique. Donc, par exemple, au niveau des longues migrations, les espèces sont en face d'un problème de changement climatique. Alors que pour des courtes migrations, c'est des changements d'habitat et aussi des espèces qui, en élargissant leur mode de migration, vont alors toucher les populations locales. Donc ça amène un problème de conflit, si je peux dire comme ça, entre les populations qui vivent là avec ces oiseaux qui s'éparpillent et qui viennent dans les milieux de vie, des habitats des hommes. Donc, pour dire, dans ce point de changement d'habitat, une forte augmentation en population humaine dans ces aires où ces oiseaux viennent, il y a bien sûr un déclin au niveau du nombre d'oiseaux migrateurs non reproducteurs qui viennent aussi à ces endroits-là. Et donc, voilà, je pense que c'est essentiellement ça. Et donc, il a fait une conclusion maintenant où il a donné, et moi je trouve que c'est ce qui est aussi beaucoup plus utile, surtout pour ceux qui veulent faire de la conservation sur le terrain, aussi impacter la politique publique, c'est qu'il faut prendre en compte, par exemple, l'utilisation des terres. Est-ce qu'il faut uniquement se concentrer sur la conservation totale des terres ou aussi regarder comment euh, on peut aller vers d'autres modes d'utilisation des terres, impliquer des gens à qui appartiennent ces terres pour pouvoir favoriser ces espèces qui migrent vers ces zones. Il faut regarder le poids entre les zones entièrement conservées ou les zones durablement utilisées. Est-ce qu'on veut faire une différence entre ces deux ou on veut considérer ces deux pour pouvoir favoriser la conservation des espèces migratrices? Il faut regarder aussi entre le changement climatique ou les changements d'habitat. Il a montré, par exemple, qu'avec le changement climatique, les espèces arrivent à s'adapter parce que en adaptant leur mode de migration, elles arrivent quand même à y arriver. Mais cela ne change pas le fait que le changement climatique doit être une priorité et considéré dans les manières dont on prend les décisions pour les espèces migratrices. Il a parlé aussi de la gouvernance et de l'éducation. Les gouvernances, c'est-à-dire les politiques publiques. Comment est-ce qu'on négocie avec les pays, par exemple au niveau des conférences des pays partis, par exemple à la COP CMS, où les gens discutent des migrations. Il faut prendre cela en compte. Alors que quand les oiseaux aussi élargissent leur mode de migration et vont dans des habitats où les hommes vivent, là, il faut faire de l'éducation. Il faut parler aux populations qui vivent dans ces endroits pour leur montrer voilà, l'importance de ces espèces. Il a parlé aussi des zones des bottlenecks. Bon, en français, je pense que c'est les zones d'engoulement où les espèces se retrouvent en masse. Donc, il faut également négocier entre les pays, voir comment euh, les, les partenariats, les relations entre les pays peuvent permettre de faciliter ces zones. Il a parlé aussi des financements qui représentent aussi un point très important qu'il faut aussi prendre en compte pour gérer je pense, ce problème que l'humanité doit régler et pour le bien des espèces migratrices. Donc, le financement, parfois difficile, parfois aussi compliqué. Donc, c'est vraiment un problème de tout le monde. Donc, voilà brièvement le ramasser de ce que Monsieur Will a dit. Il a dit beaucoup de choses, il a fait beaucoup de statistiques que j'ai pas forcément touchées ici, mais vraiment, j'espère vraiment avoir touché tous les points euh, touché par Monsieur Will. Merci.